Most actors remember one role that changed their career forever. For Viggo Mortensen, that role was Aragorn in The Lord of the Rings. It made him a worldwide star and introduced him to millions of fans who admired his quiet strength, dedication, and unforgettable performance. But years later, when people ask him about those films, he often doesn't begin by talking about battle scenes, awards, or the success of the trilogy. Instead, his thoughts return to one man who stood quietly behind the scenes and left a lasting impression on everyone around him. That man was Sir Christopher Lee. During the filming of The Return of the King, there was a moment that many people on set never forgot. Director Peter Jackson was explaining how a particular scene should be performed when Christopher Lee calmly interrupted him. What Lee said next immediately changed the atmosphere. The busy film set fell completely silent. There was no arguing, no debate, only respect. Standing nearby, carefully listening to every word, was Viggo Mortensen. At the time, he was already known as one of the most committed actors on the production, someone willing to push himself physically and mentally to make every performance feel real. Yet even he realized that he was witnessing something special. Christopher Lee was not speaking from imagination or acting experience alone. He was speaking from a lifetime that few people could fully understand. Today, at the age of 67, Viggo has spoken more openly about those memories, revealing that Christopher Lee gave him lessons that went far beyond filmmaking. They were lessons about honesty, discipline, history, and respecting the truth, no matter how uncomfortable that truth might be. Long before audiences knew him as Aragorn, Viggo Mortensen's life looked very different from the typical Hollywood success story. Born in New York City in 1958, his childhood was shaped by constant change rather than stability. His family moved between Venezuela, Denmark, and Argentina while he was still very young, exposing him to different cultures, languages, and ways of life. Those experiences gave him something many actors never develop: a natural curiosity about people. By the time he returned to the United States after his parents' divorce, he could already speak Spanish fluently and had learned to adapt wherever life placed him. After graduating from college, he did not immediately chase fame. Instead, he worked ordinary jobs, traveled through Europe, and spent years trying to discover what kind of life he truly wanted. In one of life's strange twists, he even walked into what he believed was an audition for a play, only to discover it was actually an acting school. That unexpected mistake changed everything. Rather than turning back, he decided to stay and learn. From that moment forward, acting became more than a career. It became a lifelong commitment to understanding people through storytelling. Even in his earliest roles, whether they were tiny parts or low-budget productions that few people watched, Viggo approached every performance with complete dedication. He believed that audiences deserved honesty, no matter how small the project. Critics slowly began noticing his remarkable commitment, even when the films themselves failed to attract attention. While many actors search for fame first, Viggo focused on becoming better with every role, quietly building a reputation among directors as someone who would always give everything he had. Throughout the late 1980s and most of the 1990s, Viggo Mortensen worked constantly, but success remained just out of reach. He appeared in crime dramas, thrillers, independent films, and even horror movies, accepting roles simply because he needed to pay the bills. Financially, those years were difficult, yet they shape him into the actor audiences admire today. He refused to treat any character as unimportant. If a role required physical pain, he accepted it. If it demanded emotional vulnerability, he embraced it. His determination impressed filmmakers, but mainstream audiences still barely knew his name. Many critics openly wondered why someone with so much talent had not yet become a leading star. Looking back, those difficult years may have been the greatest preparation of his career. They taught him patience, resilience, and the value of hard work without recognition. Then, almost overnight, everything changed. Peter Jackson's ambitious adaptation of The Lord of the Rings faced an unexpected crisis when the actor originally chosen to play Aragorn left the production shortly after filming had begun. Suddenly, the filmmakers needed someone capable of carrying one of the most important characters in fantasy history. Several well-known names were considered, but none proved to be the right fit. Viggo Mortensen's name entered the conversation almost at the last moment. Ironically, he was not immediately interested. Accepting the role meant leaving his young son for months while filming in New Zealand, and family had always been his highest priority. At first, he leaned towards saying no. Then something happened that changed the course of movie history. His son Henry, already a passionate fan of J.R. Tolkien's books, encouraged his father to take the opportunity. That simple conversation convinced Viggo to board a plane to New Zealand with very little preparation and no idea that he was about to become one of the most beloved heroes in modern cinema. Arriving on the set of The Lord of the Rings was both exciting and intimidating. Unlike the rest of the cast, Viggo had almost no rehearsal time. Other actors had already spent weeks learning sword fighting, horse riding, and building friendships with one another. He was suddenly dropped into one of the biggest film productions ever attempted, expected to lead a story that millions of readers already loved. Those first few days were far from comfortable. Even Peter Jackson later admitted that Viggo was still finding his way during his earlier scenes. Yet something remarkable happened. The uncertainty he felt off camera perfectly matched Aragorn's personality on screen. Aragorn was a man carrying enormous responsibility, while questioning whether he was truly ready to accept his destiny. Viggo's own nervousness added an honesty that could never have been created through rehearsals alone. As filming continued, his confidence grew naturally alongside the character's journey. He trained tirelessly with real swords, spent countless hours mastering horseback riding, and approached every battle scene with complete seriousness. Crew members quickly realized that Viggo was not interested in pretending. He wanted every movement, every expression, and every decision to feel authentic. That commitment earned the respect of everyone around him, including one legendary actor whose life experience reached far beyond Hollywood. Sir Christopher Lee had spent decades building one of the most extraordinary careers in cinema, but it was his remarkable life away from the camera that would leave the deepest impression on Viggo Mortensen. Their friendship, built quietly between takes, would become one of the most meaningful relationships either man experienced during the making of The Lord of the Rings, and the lessons that followed would stay with Viggo for the rest of his life. The deeper Viggo Mortensen settled into the world of Middle-earth, the more he realized that The Lord of the Rings was unlike any production he had ever joined. This was not simply a fantasy movie with expensive costumes and impressive special effects. Nearly everyone involved treated the story with genuine respect, as if they were protecting something far greater than a Hollywood blockbuster. Among all the talented actors, however, one person stood apart. Sir Christopher Lee was already a living legend long before he stepped onto the set as Saruman. By the time filming began, he had spent more than 50 years in the film industry, playing unforgettable characters in horror classics, historical dramas, action films, and fantasy adventures. But his greatest achievements had happened long before cameras ever followed him. Born in London in 1922, Lee lived through one of the most turbulent periods in modern history. During the Second World War, he served his country in military intelligence, gaining experiences he rarely discussed in public. Even decades later, whenever interviewers asked detailed questions about those wartime missions, Lee would often smile politely and refuse to explain further. Some memories, he believed, were not meant to become entertainment. That quiet sense of dignity immediately impressed Viggo Mortensen, who had always admired people whose actions spoke louder than their words. During breaks between scenes, while other cast members relaxed, joked, or played games, Viggo often found himself talking with Christopher Lee. Their conversations were unlike ordinary discussions between actors. They spoke about languages, history, ancient myths, European folklore, literature, and the cultures that had inspired J.R. Tolkien's writing. Both men loved learning, and those conversations quickly grew into a friendship built on mutual respect rather than Hollywood celebrity. Viggo later admitted that spending time with Christopher Lee felt like sitting beside a walking history book, except every story came from someone who had actually lived through extraordinary moments instead of simply reading about them. One of the reasons their friendship became so strong was the way both men approached acting. Neither believed in taking shortcuts. Viggo had earned a reputation for throwing himself completely into every role, no matter how physically demanding it became. While filming The Lord of the Rings, he trained endlessly with a real steel sword instead of lighter practice weapons because he believed the weight changed the way a warrior naturally moved. He spent hours on horseback until riding became second nature, and even purchased the horse he rode during filming because of the bond they had developed together. He broke 2 toes while kicking a helmet during one famous battle scene, yet stayed in character, allowing the painful scream to become part of the final movie. When one of his teeth broke during filming, he visited a dentist wearing his full costume rather than delay production. These stories eventually became famous among fans because they showed just how deeply committed he was. Christopher Lee quietly noticed every detail. Having performed countless sword fights throughout his own career and possessing real military experience, Lee understood the difference between an actor pretending to be convincing and someone fully committed to authenticity. According to members of the production, Lee admired Viggo's determination and often praised his natural instincts with weapons. For Viggo, those compliments carried enormous meaning. Praise from an ordinary co-star would have been encouraging, but praise from Christopher Lee felt entirely different. It was recognition from someone whose understanding of combat, discipline, and performance came not only from decades in front of cameras but from a lifetime of remarkable real-world experience. That respect inspired Viggo to work even harder, determined to earn every compliment through dedication rather than talent alone. Perhaps the most unforgettable lesson happened during the filming of Saruman's famous death scene, a moment that has since become one of the most discussed stories in movie history. As Peter Jackson explained how he wanted the scene to play out, he suggested that Christopher Lee should scream loudly after being stabbed in the back. Lee listened patiently before calmly correcting the director. Without raising his voice or embarrassing anyone, he explained that a person stabbed from behind in that way would not produce a dramatic scream. Instead, the body would force out a short, shocked breath because the lungs could no longer push enough air to create the sound audiences expected. The entire set fell silent. Jackson immediately understood that Christopher Lee was not criticizing his direction to win an argument. He was speaking from genuine knowledge. Lee had witnessed real violence during the war and understood details that no acting school could ever teach. Rather than insisting on Hollywood drama, Jackson trusted Lee completely and changed the performance. The scene became quieter, more believable, and far more powerful because of it. Viggo Mortensen watched that exchange with complete admiration. It reinforced something he had believed throughout his career, that truth always creates stronger storytelling than exaggeration. Years later, Viggo reflected on that moment with enormous respect, explaining that Christopher Lee carried a sense of realism impossible to imitate. While most actors spend years learning how to appear convincing, Lee possessed an authenticity built through real experiences that could never be recreated on a film set. For Viggo, that lesson became one of the greatest gifts he received during the making of The Lord of the Rings. As filming continued over several years, the bond between the two actors only grew stronger. Christopher Lee was much older than most of the cast, yet he never acted as though he was above anyone else. He shared stories when asked, offered advice without forcing it upon others, and encouraged younger performers simply by setting an example through his professionalism. He also had a unique connection to Tolkien's world that nobody else involved in the trilogy could claim. Decades before the films were made, Lee had actually met J.R.R. Tolkien in person. He had read The Lord of the Rings nearly every year for much of his adult life and dreamed of appearing in a film adaptation long before one existed. Although he originally hoped to play Gandalf, he accepted the role of Saruman because he understood that age had changed what he could physically perform. Rather than allowing pride to stand in the way, he embraced the role that best suited him and delivered one of the most memorable performances of his career. That humility made a lasting impression on Viggo. Here was a man who had achieved worldwide fame, survived a world war, mastered multiple languages, and worked with generations of filmmakers, yet he remained curious, disciplined, and eager to learn. Watching Christopher Lee each day reminded Viggo that true greatness is never measured by awards or popularity. It is measured by the willingness to keep improving, to respect the craft, and to remain humble no matter how much success has already been achieved. Those lessons would quietly shape Viggo's own career long after the camera stopped rolling, influencing every important decision he made in the years that followed. When the Lord of the Rings trilogy came to an end, many people believed Viggo Mortensen would do what most actors would have done after starring in one of the biggest film franchises in history. Hollywood studios were ready to offer him blockbuster roles, sequels, and action films that could have earned him millions of dollars. He could have spent the rest of his career playing heroes who looked and sounded like Aragorn. But that was never the path he wanted to follow. Fame had never been his greatest goal. Instead of chasing the biggest paychecks, Viggo chose projects that challenged him as an artist. He turned down several major franchise opportunities because he believed the stories lacked originality. When plans were discussed for The Hobbit, he reportedly refused to return as Aragorn because the character was not part of Tolkien's original novel, and he did not want to appear simply to satisfy fans. That decision perfectly reflected the values he had admired in Christopher Lee. Truth always came before popularity. Integrity mattered more than commercial success. Over the following years, Viggo proved that philosophy again and again. He delivered unforgettable performances in A History of Violence, Eastern Promises, The Road, Captain Fantastic, and Green Book, earning multiple Academy Award nominations along the way. For every role, he prepared with extraordinary commitment. He studied accents until they sounded completely natural, researched real people whose lives inspire the characters, and even changed his body weight when necessary. Whether he was losing weight, gaining weight, learning new skills, or living like his character between filming days, Viggo approached every project with the same determination that Christopher Lee had quietly encouraged years earlier. Rather than allowing one famous role to define his entire career, he continued searching for stories that challenged him both personally and professionally, proving that true artists never stop growing. Christopher Lee's influence, however, reached far beyond acting techniques or professional discipline. What stayed with Viggo the longest was the way Lee carried himself every single day. Despite playing some of cinema's greatest villains from Dracula to Scaramanga, Count Dooku, and Saruman, those who work with him often describe him as thoughtful, kind, intelligent, and deeply respectful. Off-camera, he loved literature, classical music, history, painting, and even heavy metal music, recording successful albums well into his 80s simply because he enjoyed exploring new creative experiences. Viggo immediately recognized a familiar spirit. Like Lee, he had interests that stretched far beyond filmmaking. He wrote poetry, photographed landscapes, painted, composed music, and even founded his own publishing company to support artists whose work might never attract mainstream attention. Their friendship was built not on celebrity status but on curiosity. Both men believed that artists should continue learning throughout their lives instead of repeating the same formulas. Christopher Lee demonstrated that age should never become an excuse to stop creating. Even in his later years, he remained active, energetic, and passionate about every new opportunity. That example left a permanent mark on Viggo's thinking. Success was not about becoming famous. It was about remaining curious, disciplined, and willing to improve every single day. Those qualities became just as important to Viggo as any acting award he would later receive. When Christopher Lee passed away in June 2015 at the age of 93, the film world lost one of its greatest legends. Tributes poured in from directors, actors, writers, musicians, and millions of fans around the globe. Peter Jackson remembered long conversations filled with unforgettable stories and remarkable wisdom. Many people celebrated Lee's incredible list of achievements, but those who truly knew him spoke less about the famous roles and more about the remarkable person behind them. Viggo Mortensen was among those who continued honoring Lee's legacy through the values he practiced rather than through emotional speeches alone. Whenever he reflected on their time together, he emphasized the importance of honesty, respect, preparation, and lifelong learning. He explained that Christopher Lee possessed something impossible to forge a lifetime of real experiences that gave every performance extraordinary depth. Watching Lee work reminded Viggo that audiences can always sense the difference between someone pretending to understand a subject and someone who genuinely does. That realization influenced the choices he continued making throughout his career. Instead of searching for easier roles or safer opportunities, he consistently accepted projects requiring patience, sacrifice, and complete dedication. In many ways, Christopher Lee remained a silent mentor whose lessons continued shaping Viggo's work long after they had filmed their final scene together. Looking back today, it becomes clear that The Lord of the Rings gave Viggo Mortensen far more than worldwide fame. It introduced him to lifelong friendships, unforgettable experiences, and a mentor whose wisdom could never be learned inside a classroom. At 67, when Viggo speaks about Christopher Lee, his words carry genuine admiration because they come from personal experience rather than distant memories. He is not simply remembering an actor he once worked beside. He is remembering a man who quietly demonstrated how integrity, discipline, humility, and respect should guide both an artist and a human being. In an entertainment industry often driven by publicity and instant success, their relationship reminds us that the most valuable lessons usually happen away from cameras, during ordinary conversations that few people ever witness. Christopher Lee never needed to announce himself as a teacher because he taught through his actions every single day. Viggo Mortensen paid attention, and those lessons helped shape one of the most respected careers in modern cinema. Perhaps that is the real reason he continues speaking about Christopher Lee today. Awards eventually gather dust, famous characters become part of film history, and blockbuster success slowly fades into memory. But the influence of a truly remarkable person can last a lifetime. For Viggo Mortensen, Sir Christopher Lee was far more than a legendary actor. He was living proof that greatness is earned through character, curiosity, and unwavering dedication to the truth. And maybe that is the most powerful lesson any artista any of us can hope to leave behind. Thanks for watching. We will see you in the next story.